Good morning. This is Daily Hebrew Declarations with Daniel Jedediah Cook, and I'm reading the declaration for today, February the 17th, 2021. The three Hebrew letters we're honoring today are Nun, Pei, and Shin. Along with those three living letters, we're also honoring the spirit of understanding, the spirit of counsel, and the spirit of might. The declaration today reads this: Upright, righteous Son of Yahweh, a portal of release for our breath, releasing spiritual energy into the universe, laying hold of the things of Yahweh, and not letting go. Today's declaration kind of brings up something that I heard, and really Apostle Aaron had asked me about the other night during church, or the other day during church. And he was talking about the Hebrew word for grace. And the Hebrew word for grace is the Hebrew word chen. And when I look at the letters, it begins to expand a greater understanding of what grace really is, especially when I dig in just a little bit deeper with regards to this. But it fits perfectly with what today's declaration is talking about. You see, when we look at chen, we look at this place of the chet. Chet means fence or boundary, but it also talks about the place of a covenant. When I see chet, I not only think about this place of being protected, if you will, of being inside of the sheepfold, because chet reminds me of the when Yeshua was talking about no one comes into the sheepfold, or anybody who else who tries to get into the sheepfold other than through the door is a thief and a robber, and that he is the door and the portal into the place of the protection. Well, that's chet. To me, it's a perfect picture of that. But not only that, when we look at the way the letter is shaped, what it's made out of, and those sort of things, we begin to see that a chet is actually a vav and a zayin that have been yoked together. So the sixth and the seventh letters being yoked together, it begins to show the picture of the bride and the bride of Christ. And the groom. The bride of Christ and the groom. We begin to see this place of covenant, of promise. We begin to see this place of when even Scripture talks about how that his yoke is easy and his burden is light, and that we have been yoked together with him, so that he is taking more of the pressure than really we are. Especially when you look back in the day when they would take an oxen who was mature next to an oxen who was immature. Most of the time, the oxen who was mature began to really take the majority of the load, because the oxen who was immature began to kind of buck up against it, not really understanding what was going on, and would help, but not maybe as much as they could or should. And it took maturity for that young oxen to be able to grow to a place where there was a little bit more of an equal type of connection, and then movement, and getting even more done even quicker, because there's no longer the bucking up against the yoke. So you can see a lot of different pictures here when you look at the living letter chet. So I begin to see, especially as it applies to grace, I begin to see this place of Yahweh's promises. It's funny. I hope my School of the Living Letters Year 2 is listening to today's podcast, because we're going to be talking about and engaging with chen, or grace, at our next meeting. And so I'm kind of alluding to a little bit before we even get started. So if you will, Year 2 of the School of the Living Letters, this is your prep for this week, okay? This is a little bit of what Yahweh has been releasing through to me about this as we engage on it next Tuesday. If you'd like to be a part of our School of the Living Letters, please reach out and let us know. There is a prerequisite to Year 2, and that is going through Year 1. But we still have the enrollment still open until this next Thursday. But anyway, I want to continue on with this, because when I look at chen, I look at the place of not only the chet and the place of promise, the place of really security and covenant. When I look at the nun final begins to begin to show another aspect of that, because really Yahweh has only given me one definition for the living letter nun final. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say nun final, some may call that nun sofit. Uh, Basically, these are letters that have a slightly different shape than the original Hebrew living letter, and they're found at the end of Hebrew word, hence the reason for the final or sofit. And basically, it takes the definition of the letter itself and really takes it and expands it out to its completion or its finishing, its fulfillment, its original intent, if you will. And there's really only one definition that Yahweh's ever given me with the living letter nun final, and that is till we all come to the fullness of the measure of the stature of Christ. Because one of the ways that I saw nun final was literally as a measuring rod. So many times in Scripture you see where it talks about a measuring rod, and I realized that for me the only measuring rod that I should ever measure myself against is the fullness of the measure of the stature of Christ. In other words, measuring myself against Christ and Messiah himself. And so to me, that helped me because so many times people would give me their measuring rod and say, hey, you should look like this. You should act like this. You should be like this. But the sad part about it was if I could stop and think long enough, at least during the days when this was happening, I would realize they're taking that same measuring rod and measuring it up against themselves, and they're not able to measure up against it because what they feel, what they think has become a measuring rod and not necessarily the fullness of the measure of the stature of Messiah. You see what I mean? Because the measuring rod is based on what others have handed them, what others have told them that they are supposed to be like or do. I only want to measure myself against Messiah. I only want to measure myself against the fullness of what Yahweh has promised me, not against what somebody else's interpretation of that is. Well, that is nun final, nun sofit. So when I look at the word grace, I begin to see this picture of the promise of bringing me to the fullness of the measure of the stature of Messiah. Now that starts making sense to me when I talk about grace. But it's funny because when I think about that, I always think, okay, what is the root word of a particular word? Chain is not the root word of that word itself specifically. There is another Hebrew word, chanan, that actually talks about chanan. Forgive my pronunciations. I'm still learning how to pronounce everything appropriately. Let me just be real here, okay? And but it's chet nun final is what it's is the root word of chain. Chain means grace. Chanan, that's the more appropriate way of saying it. Chanan, actually it talks about being gracious or acting out grace. It's a verb that talks about the act of graciousness. But it's funny that the Hebrew word for grace is missing one of those letters that's in the Hebrew word chanan, the nun in the middle. And so to me, it begins to speak of this place of the nun in the middle talking about us, talking about being a son, really talking about, because a nun literally means son, king, heir, and priest. It means seed. It means legacy. It means many different things, but one of those things being that of us being a son of Almighty Yahweh. Well, in the Hebrew word for grace, chain, that nun is missing. And it makes sense. Do you see what I'm saying? Because in this place of Yahweh's grace for us, it's talking about Yahweh's grace for us. It's not talking about us being gracious. It's talking about Yahweh being the fullness of his grace to us, that in a sense, he is giving us his grace, but that grace has absolutely nothing to do with us. That none has been removed, if you will, because it's his grace to us, his love to us, his care for us, his ability and his place of saying, this is what I'm giving you. Now, in that place, Chen, Yahweh saying, Chen, I give you my grace so that what? You can be Hanan, Hanan, Hanan. You can be gracious because it's my grace that is flowing through you. It is my grace that is in you.